relationship that these cities have, especially when we're talking about the music and the culture and things like that, and the access. You have to think about the relationship of these cities.
Today's guest is a fascinating individual. He does many things in the music world, and it was so great to connect with him. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting with Luke Stewart, who is a DC, New York City-based musician and organizer of important musical presentations. And I like the wording of that. He has a strong presence in the national and international improvised music community. He does a radio show. He does many things. We get into that in this episode. The audio on this was a little bit rough. It gets better as we go. So, but the content is great. So just FYI as you listen to this. And I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors, Dorico, Ear Trumpet Labs, Practisma, and Modacity. More on them later. But let's dive into this conversation with the fascinating artist, Luke Stewart.
Nobody's playing in bars or clubs or anything like that anymore. And I'm also not sure if I'm interested in doing that anymore. Once all things come back to quote unquote normal, I think that's one of the aspects of normalcy that I would like to not go back to.
Interesting.
If I can help it.
Like in terms of the lifestyle, or just you're finding other?
Just in terms of the hierarchies and like the systemic like ways of being, like the relationships that artists have had with venues, with like the venue bar system. Like it's problematic. Like it's been problematic for years, and I think it's like this is a prime opportunity to say no, or like let's have a different conversation about what that means. Or like let's have a different conversation about what that relationship is. Because also, like, if you notice, where are you exactly?
I'm in San Francisco.
I don't know what's happening in San Fran, but I imagine it's the same, where, the bars and restaurants are open, and they're having the outdoor, promenades, and people are brunching radically, but there's no music, like, and their businesses, like they're businesses whose purpose is to have food and drink, not to have music. Like, even if it's a lot of the venues, even it's like, they have to keep their doors open with food and drink, and there's no music. And there doesn't seem to be a real fight to have music. So even in this time where that relationship has existed tenuously, like in that hierarchical way, like it's showing itself again in this period. There are obviously some individual businesses, probably in San Fran that you enjoy, and like, places that I enjoy here, that on an individual basis they're cool and are wanting to support. But again, it's like that relationship between the artist and the venue is tenuous.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I barely registered. Radical brunching is a good way to put it, and that's essentially what's happening here too. Probably we're like a couple months behind in terms of that. Things are barely open, but yeah, I can't remember the last time I heard live music. It's certainly not happening at these places. So right when they come back, that's not one of the first things to come back, which kind of shows the hierarchy is a good way it's a good term for it.
Yeah. And obviously there are also safety reasons why it's not coming back.
Right.
But it to me, it shows like, it's a continuation of the same pattern of oppression that has existed for, again, the relationship with artists and these places where artists of all kinds play. So I'm more interested going forward in doing more essentially independent things, DIY independent sort of things. going forward, which is a lot of my experience anyway.
Right.
And always where I've felt the most comfortable and felt the most nourished and fulfilled as an artist. So just go back to that.
Right. So you'd been doing a lot of more independent, like I don't know if you like house concerts or just independently organized things. That was a pretty big percentage of what you were doing when you were playing out.
It's a big part of my history, my experience as in the journey of being a musician. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I appreciate Gaylord DeWald made the suggestion. He said, "Hey, you should get in touch with Luke." And I started checking out what you've been doing, and I was like, "Oh, absolutely." So I appreciate you hanging out with me for a bit. Yeah. And these are totally not live at all. I guess we've probably started, but if you want to edit anything or whatever, just say the word. It's very much just as if we were hanging out, which I preferred to do before the pandemic. I was getting into a groove of going to a place and actually spending time with someone and hearing them play or playing with them. And so I'm back to Zoom, but we're all back to Zoom at the moment, I guess. So
yeah, that's for sure.
I don't even know where to start. Are you from Mississippi? Is that what I was doing some research? Did you grow up in Mississippi?
I did grow up in Mississippi. Yeah.
Where in Mississippi? I'm just curious.
I grew up in a town called Ocean Springs. It's right on the Gulf Coast.
Okay.
It's right next to Biloxi. That's the one that people may have heard of.
Sure. I think I was watching, it might have been a YouTube video of you just kind of talking about your life and how you ended up in DC, but there was no orchestra or anything like that. Am I right?
Right.
Okay.
When I was growing up in Mississippi?
Yeah.
Yeah, zero orchestra. I think at the time, I don't know what it's like now. I still don't think they have an orchestra in my school system, but at the time, I think the only public school system that had an orchestra was in Jackson in the whole state. And then there were like a couple of private schools that had, a small orchestra. And I remember while I was in high school, the sort of like the one art school had just opened. Like it opened when I was in like 11th grade. In a different part in like a very rural part of Mississippi. I think it's called Brookhaven is where it was. It's like sort of a Delta-ish area. But yeah, that had just started when I was in high school. Like it started while I was in high school, and I think it was only visual art. I think now they have music and stuff. But yeah, like I probably said that in that documentary or in that interview or whatever to sort of explain like. Or to make the point that, to drive home the point also, like, that things aren't even for everybody in terms of picking up an instrument like the bass.
Yeah.
Like the opportunity to even deal with it is really dependent on where you live, like where you're from. And like the access to like just that instrument is, for a lot of people, not just me growing up in Mississippi, it's just not possible. So like, again, I didn't have the opportunity to even touch an upright bass until I moved to DC. Growing up in Mississippi, it was like being exposed to a completely different thing. But also, I think I said this in that interview as well, was that there was no overriding like cultural movement or influence that would like steer me any particular which way, like it's not like where, say, growing up in like San Francisco or something like that and being influenced by, say, like, DJ, like real intense like DJ culture and like electronic music culture, or some of the like I guess like electronic dance music culture, like that's the thing that I hear about the most and that I follow the most in San Francisco, like in San Francisco specifically, not Oakland.
Sure.
But yeah, like it's not like that, or being in a place like New York or Philly that has like or DC where it's like go and like all these other sort of hardcore cultural influences, especially in an urban space. Growing up, I was sort of like left to like, me and my friends were sort of left to our own devices to sort of check out anything we wanted and to be like sort of influenced by a lot of things. Like, it wasn't like music was never like a style thing. We weren't like, punk rockers or anything like that, even though we did play punk music and, played at those shows. But it wasn't like it was never a style thing. Like, music for me has never been like a style thing. It's always been, following passion and interest. And I think, especially as I get older, I appreciate more and more, because I hated being in Mississippi at the time. But as I get older, I appreciate it more and more.
So punk rock was in your roots. Playing electric bass. Is that what?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My first like band scenario outside of school was playing in a punk band with electric bass.
Nice.
Like, school. I played saxophone in school, but that was just like, that was marching band. And like wind ensemble sort of thing, and like, it was school, so like in my mind it was a different thing. And also, like, I played saxophone because I was interested in jazz, but there wasn't a jazz band or anything like that. And like, the music and the aesthetic was very much more geared towards the classic, like, Southern marching band stuff, or like, that collegiate, woodwind ensemble sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really geared towards jazz. Although, and again, when I was in high school, I think I expressed an interest in it, specifically with my band director. And I think he got excited about, like, it was me and like a couple of other people that were sort of interested and like expressed interest. And had the opportunity to, like, have some really, some conversations with our band director at the time, who also, we came to find out, because he didn't really just like offer up this information, but like, we come to find out that he, like, he actually was a jazz musician, more like academic wise, and like whatever that could be. In like Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in the 70s, which, come to find out, there was, like, he talked about studying with Bill Evans's brother. Apparently was there and was like super influential in turning a lot of people on to the music and all that kind of stuff. And my band director played with him, and turns out he played upright bass. Again, at LSU, like, there was no opportunity. Again, there was no opportunity to deal with it, really. But anyway, after that, we did like form a jazz band, in my high school. But the charts were just like, it was just reading charts. There wasn't really improvisation. It was more so like we would play like a feature during the halftime show, or like a couple of times we did have like some gigs, but it wasn't improvisatory. It was more so just like reading the chart and getting the sound, and playing like sort of big band, academic style big band versions of like, What's New, or I'll Be Seeing You. I think we played like Sing, 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 stuff like that. So, it was what it was, and in a lot of ways, I think that experience, also looking back, it's one of those experiences in my life where it's like, you make do with what you got. And the process of making do with what you got actually makes you more adaptable to like real life situations where like you don't need to have like being not exposed to the best and not being used to the best, and like make or what is called the best, like gives you a more scrappy, resourceful sort of approach and attitude, or it can.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. No, I totally resonate with that. You know, I grew up in South Dakota.
Shit. So, yeah, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I came from a little bigger place than your part of Mississippi. That's why I was curious, because northern Mississippi, you're closer to Memphis and that kind of thing. But
where I'm from is New Orleans.
Yeah. Okay.
I grew up 90 miles. Ocean Springs was like 90 or so miles east of New Orleans. So like that was the like major, if any sort of cultural influence, if I can back up there, it was like New Orleans style, because that was like the city where we would go to, you know, see some of the bigger shows and like, you know, hang out and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of my friends from that time live in New Orleans now, because that was, again, it's like the natural city to move to if you're from that area.
This episode is brought to you by the Practisma Practice Journal. And here's Practisma author Susanna Klein on why journaling is so important for practicing.
It's a little trick to make the invisible progress visible, or to get you to recognize, hey, things are still slow going, but I'm doing the right thing.
I'm a big fan of this journal. I've gone through all 16 weeks myself on my own personal journey. It is so cool what Susanna's created. It's packed with research-based strategies to turn your ho-hum practice into extraordinary practice, and it really works. Learn more at practisma.com, where you can download the introductory chapter of the journal for free. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. But 90 miles is far enough that like you're not there every day, right? So you're really isolated. Sure. What's interesting,
and New Orleans is a very particular kind of community where like it's one of those places where it's like if you're not from there, like you're really not from there, you know.
Interesting. That's interesting.
It's like culture. I remember like and people talk about it all the time. It's like back then it was a thing of like, where'd you go to high school? You know, like one of the questions was like, where'd you go to high school? Mm-hmm. And like if it's in New Orleans and it's like, okay, you're down, you can call yourself like, you know, down and all that kind of stuff. But if not, then you know it's like you're in another category. And then it was like year before Katrina.
Yeah, right.
Or like you know it, and you know, stuff like that. It's that kind of city. In my experience, you know, everybody's experience is different, but like in my observations and experiences, that's how it's been for that city, is where it's like you gotta kind of be from there. You know,
yeah,
like it's that kind of vibe.
It's interesting. I lived for 23 years in Chicago before heading out to San Francisco. So Chicago is definitely not like what you're talking about with New Orleans, but it's probably a little more so than San Francisco, where like everybody here, it's like if you've been here 18 months, you're a local. You know, I mean, maybe that's an exaggeration, but there's just so much churn in the Bay Area, or more so than certainly. How I'm guessing DC is probably a little closer to what it's like here in San Francisco in terms of new people coming in, or
very much so, much so. And that's it's like it's at this point it's kind of part of the identity of DC.
Yeah.
But it's also like a point of contention culturally, because like it's one of those like it's the language of gentrification, essentially.
Sure.
It's the language of erasure, of like, you know, because there's actually like a very deep like local history in DC that, you know, every time somebody says like, you know, oh well, I've been in DC for 3 years, I guess I'm a Washingtonian, you know, stuff like that, you know, like it or like, you know, just the different like approaches to the situation that comes along with like that train of thought, mm-hmm. that can be like contentious and problematic in talking about like these cities, DC being particularly one of them. that I've experienced, like just in the years that I've been dealing with DC, that I've existed in DC. It's like I've seen it like change dramatically, like several times in over the course of now 15 years. Like it's changed dramatic. It changes dramatically, like every few years, in terms of like the next stage of development and gentrification and erasure. So that's what happens, and like people from DC is a different conversation from the people that move in and out. That churning that you say, like that's a whole other different dynamic from the people that are actually from DC.
Right.
And it's and because of that churn, also in San Francisco too, because of that churn, it makes these cities so expensive, so like oppressively expensive, and it just exacerbates that problem even more, where there have been several articles over the years about DC specifically being the most gentrified city in America. And again, I can attest to that. When I moved to DC in 2005, I think the Black population of DC was like, it was between 60 and 70%. And now it's like closer to 40%. So like in the time that I've been there, I've seen the Black American population of DC decline by something like 20%.
Wow.
And I've also seen, the rents increase dramatically. So like one of the good points that one article that I read talks about, which is very key, something that I've always noted in terms of like the differences in gentrification in, say, DC versus New York, is that DC is smaller. So the feeling is much more intense, because it's like, they're in New York and Philly and places like that, there are little pockets where you can kind of like be in a real zone. Same in DC too. There's still pockets, but like it's smaller. So it's the dynamic is a lot more intense, because it's like, it's just really happening all over the place. And even just like even in terms of like the traffic, you have people from, license plates from Virginia and Maryland, not all of them are like, diehard suburbanites who are just trying to come to DC to work their good government job, which that's a lot of the population too. But a lot of those people are like, damn, I got pushed out of DC and I still have to go to DC to work and visit my family and all this kind of stuff, but I'm pissed. Or like back in the back of my mind, I'm pissed that I can't live in DC. So like there's always like an undercurrent of like animosity amongst like everybody. I imagine it's the same in San Francisco too.
Yeah,
like
you're describing the Bay Area. This is extremely similar, and yeah, it's interesting. I never really thought about how the way that DC is sort of so tightly condensed, and it's its own thing, but hemmed in.
Actually, DC and San Francisco are like comparably sized cities.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Like geography, yeah.
Yeah, and probably population too. I don't remember exactly what the DC population is, but I think
DC's got like 700,000.
Yeah, we've got 850 or something like that. So, but it's again, you want to talk about gentrification, this place and the escalating rents and what that does to so many levels of society. Whether we're thinking about how hard it becomes to be an artist, or or do anything that taking a chance at all, to the people that have lived there for so long that are pushed out, and even pushed out of Oakland now. I mean, Oakland is almost as expensive as San Francisco. It's just totally crazy. And so many of my freelance musician friends or other independent artists, I mean, it's like become impossible, essentially.
Yeah, San Francisco. Yeah, all the articles that have been written about San Francisco and like the documentaries about the mission and like Tenderloin and like Fillmore,
Exactly.
all these places, like, and it's hurtful. Like, it's not hurtful, but it's like one of the biggest things that I guess that transition from Mississippi to DC was that, like, growing up in, maybe I mentioned this in that other interview also, but like growing up in Mississippi at the time, and again, like, and looking back and reflecting on the time, but like at the time, my feeling in terms of like racism and those sorts of dynamics was that, like, it's the new South. Like in my experience, especially on the coast, like the coast is culturally different than the rest of Mississippi. Like,
Sure.
like growing up, it was like if you go above Interstate 10, if you go above I-10, then you're in Mississippi. If you're below I-10, then it's like you're cool. Which I imagine is still true to a certain extent.
Okay.
But at the time, it was like, it's the new South, but like we're cool now, and like we're trying to move forward. Which was that obviously has its own problematic dynamics also. But for the most part, it was like, all the stuff that's stereotypical about Mississippi. Like I had the feeling like that wasn't true, because I did have a number of racist experiences, and also like reflecting back on certain dynamics, like in high school and like, just with the community in general. Like I noticed a lot of things. But moving from Mississippi to DC was the first time that I encountered something like gentrification, and it affected me so much because it's literally racism that you can see.
Yeah.
And that's where I like sort of came to the conclusion that, yeah, in cities like DC, New York, these places effectively are much more racist than Mississippi, than my experience in Mississippi, because in terms of the power dynamic and the economic dynamic, for the most part, down south, everybody's pretty much on the same level, except like, you have your dynamic of like, the good old boy, the so-called like good old boy system, where like, it's a family that's been around for generations and blah, blah, all that kind of stuff. But like, that family might also have a lot of, people that's working in the shipyard or like working at the graveyard, doing some blue collar job, and like their grandma's okay. The grandma got like the big house in the country type of thing. So like in general, like the power dynamics are more level from what I saw, from what I experienced, was like the power dynamics are more even in the South. And also there's a much higher Black American population in the South.
Yeah.
In terms of like percentage wise. So when you get to cities when you get to the cities, the northeastern cities, it's like you experience the true effects of racism, where there are you see redlining, like you can see it, you can see the justice system, like you can go downtown to court and see where and find all the Black people, essentially find all the people of color. You can go down to, at one point I had to get food stamps, going down to that place, and it's, like that's where all the Black people are.
Right.
And it's not like that in the South, to the extent that it is so polarized in the cities, in the northeastern cities, where like the effects of economic racial oppression is just so apparent and affects society so deeply that it's like, wow, I'm experiencing racism at another level on a daily basis, like just walking out my door and being here and seeing this and like figuring out how I'm gonna, and like figuring out my place in all of this, you know?
Yeah. I'll bet there are a lot of, I don't know how much time you spend in Chicago, but you're ringing a lot of familiarity bells in terms of my experiences in Chicago, you know, and just the whole history of that place where, you know, another northern city where it's just so the racist actions are so clear, where like the old Mayor Daley literally built an interstate separating Bronzeville from his neighborhood. I mean, exactly. And it's crazy. I lived for a few years in Hyde Park, so South Side Chicago, where, you know, go back to the 40s, you know, all these jazz clubs on 55th Street and all that, and then that's one of those places that the 50s, the urban renewal hit in, you know, in unbelievably hard, you know, similar to the Fillmore here in San Francisco, but I've spent a lot more time in Chicago, and the neighborhoods then, just watching what happened over the years I lived there was remarkable. And in terms of gentrification, that whole area between downtown Chicago and Hyde Park, you could see the gentrification happening. There's actually a book on my shelf here behind me called Black on the Block about that exact, it's the area just north of where Obama lived, Kenwood and Oakland in Chicago. Right. And just the dynamics of that are so fascinating. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just how that area, it's just a very complicated, that book in particular is about how it's mostly being gentrified by Black people coming back to the city in that specific area, running into people that had been there a long time, and just the relations. It really made me think as a white guy finding himself on the south side of Chicago. It's, there are a lot of troubling aspects to that city.
Yeah, and I think one aspect of it is that we have to examine the relationship that these cities have, especially when we're talking about the music and the culture and things like that, and the access. We have to think about the relationship of these cities. Like, for me, like it's been useful, you know, going back and looking at the history, you know, as you explore the history of the music, you know, like exploring the history of the cities and the environment that the music developed in. Yeah. And specifically, again, looking at the relationship that these cities have towards, you know, in the conversation of like jazz / Black American music, what have you, you have to look at the relationship of between the cities and Black American people. You know, as you have to look at how, you know, in the 40s in Chicago, like what was the dynamic happening, you know, like at the same time that there were all those clubs down in Hyde Park, you know, there were plans to put a freeway there. Yeah. You know, that was also like building up on that was like a buildup of plans from like that put the Black American population in the South Side to begin with. Right. You know? Right. Like in the Great Migration, everybody going there. And like there's a reason why they were all there. Right. Exactly. But then it's like, then you can also zoom out and see how Chicago like treated all its newcomers. Like they put the Polish people here, put the Italians here, you know, like, and just the codification of the segregation of the city, you know? Right. Like Chicago's got a very interesting and particular kind of history and dynamic in that regard. Also geography, because it's like, you know, it's a mission to like, if you live, say, on like in the far south side or the far north side or even downtown, like it's a mission getting places that's not in your immediate vicinity, like that's not in your neighborhood. You know, like it's kind of like it like takes some effort, you know, some extra effort to get around sometimes in Chicago.
Yeah.
To go see music.
Yeah, no, that's a good observation, and that's quite different from here in San Francisco, where everything's just so much closer that nobody, like Chicago it's a fascinating city for so many reasons, but it definitely is a city of neighborhoods, and there are so many neighborhoods where you would just do everything. You'd live, work, do your shopping. Pilsen, which is a neighborhood with a lot of parallels to the Mission District here in San Francisco. I mean, you would work along the canal, you know, at your factory job, or do this or that. You'd eat, you do your banking and everything there. If we go to Bronzeville, you know, 35th Street in Chicago was this thriving place. There's this great, the Sunset Cafe or something like that Louis Armstrong used to play at, that now is hilariously an Ace Hardware, but it's still got the stage there. It's like one of the only remaining businesses. Yeah, that city, if you did a map, you know, pick your decade, you would see the Polish area, the German area, Bronzeville, the Latino area, and it's very, very much extremely segregated.
And it's like that's the trend for all these cities. Like it never just happened, or it was never allowed to just happen organically.
Yeah,
you know, because of the racist policies of the government, of like the U.S. from the federal all the way down, like during that time. You know, obviously, like that's sort of the big elephant in the room, like in terms of like examining all of these things, and also a testament to, you know, obviously a testament to the music, because the music has helped to sort of break down some of those barriers, but it also serves to ring like doubly true also, like in certain aspects of the music culture and industry. You know, like it's the access to the opportunity to be culturally literate, to be inspired, like and then to have the space and time to develop as an artist, like the access to that lifestyle, is kind of where it all, in terms of the music, is kind of where it all bears down to, and like and also which approaches to that lifestyle is validated and celebrated, respected, you know, because at the same time that, you know, say in Chicago, when all that stuff was happening, you know, like what was the prevailing like respectable music at the time definitely was not jazz,
right?
You know, it was still like that was still in many circles, like from the high society, like you know, Baryshnikov, you know, Stokowski, sort of high classical world, not the individuals necessarily, but like that industry, you know, looked down on jazz for years. Still looks down on jazz to a certain extent, or still looks down on that approach. And whether it's the black thing, or whether it's the improvisation thing, or, you know, whether it's the rhythm thing, you know, like coming at, or a combination of all of those things, like it's still second class, like still to this day. Because of the hierarchical roots that were set back then, just even in how we even look at music, like how we even value what music is, you know, like even, you know, the composer thing, like the capital C composer thing, like the fact that this is the pinnacle of like of being a person who is effectively instilling their own individual approach upon a group of people, not allowing and essentially claiming the work of that group of people as your own, because it's your idea. It's like the idea becomes more than the work itself. Whereas in improvisation, the idea and the work are on the same playing field. They're equal.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that hierarchy begins to shut down, and that was the thing that was evident in those neighborhoods in Hyde Park, in Central Avenue, in Fillmore, U Street, Harlem, all these places where it created. It was like the musical approach, like just the musical approach itself, invited people. It broke down the hierarchies and invited people to come in and enjoy themselves together. So like that, it's like some of the subversive ways that the music has chipped away at those structures, at those hierarchical structures.
People have been saying such great things about my course with Discover Double Bass Beginners Classical Bass. Here is Nicholas Walker, professor of double bass at Ithaca College and past president of the International Society of Bassists. Nicholas writes, Jason draws from this vast network with his contagious enthusiasm and love of learning. Presented through the beautifully organized and easily accessible framework of Discover Double Bass, this is a terrific learning experience for any beginner, as well as a great model for any new teacher. I am blushing, Nicholas. Thank you so much. I'm just so thrilled with how this course came out. Jeff Chalmers and the whole team at Discover Double Bass are so professional. It was such a great experience, and it was the best representation of what I would love to take every single beginner through in terms of format and presentation. And I'm just so happy that it's out there. You can learn more. We've got a link in the show notes, or you can just visit discoverdouble.com/Jason Heath. Keeping track of what you practice is so critical. And my practice companion, Modacity, it does it for me. It's so awesome. Here's Modacity founder and CEO Mark Gelfo on how this works.
Accounting before the spreadsheet was manually handwritten ledgers, and that's where most musicians have been for the last 200 years. And it's time to automate that and save some time and let people focus on what's really important, which is performing on their instrument.
And that is exactly what Modacity has done for me. I feel so much more focused and energized and enthusiastic about practicing. I love this app so much. You can learn more at modacity.co and visit our website for a special offer for lifetime access for this app. Such a cool piece of technology. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Modacity. It's such a different approach to music making. If you think about someone who aspires to, let's say, be in a symphony orchestra and play have that idea, coming from that composer, like sort of imposed on them, versus, the improvisatory artist, the creative artist. It's just interesting how it struck me a couple of years ago. I went to SF Jazz for the first time, and I realized that's the only, I believe that's the only institution in any U.S. city or major U.S. city solely dedicated to jazz. I think that's true, which is kind of insane if you think about like how
Wait, I could think school?
SF Jazz, the Jazz Institute.
SF Jazz.
Yeah.
Right.
But I mean, it's just remarkable that
Lincoln Center,
Right, but Lincoln Center does many things, right? I think so.
Well, there's jazz at Lincoln Center.
Right. There we go.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah.
Yeah.
that point about access, I think is so interesting because, like, and especially if we're talking, thinking about bass, upright bass, because the only reason I am playing upright bass is because there was an upright bass in my middle school, and my violin playing middle school teacher said, "Hey, we need someone to play this." And how common that story is among bass players, right? I mean, parents don't generally rent a bass and send their kid out to take it's just we sort of find the instrument, or the instrument finds us, or whatever. Right. And if there is no instrument, right, that's it's it can be done, and I think you're an example of that, having bass in your life along with everything else you do, but not having that bass. I mean, it's crazy. And of course, now in this moment we're speaking right now, I'm just noticing here in San Francisco, I think with the pandemic and nobody's, going to school, the San Francisco public schools, I think half of their orchestra teachers have retired just in the pandemic. So, they were close to retirement, and just thinking of all the things that don't work well over Zoom, orchestra in a big city environment, with a $15 million deficit before the pandemic, it's so what's it going to look like after the pandemic?
How is that possible? San Francisco?
Oh man, we could have.
How is that possible?
Oh, you want to talk about a troubling place. I mean, where you're like, look, you're walking by Twitter, you're walking by Salesforce, and and then you're walking right by people with absolutely nothing. This is a troubling city before the pandemic, and seeing the haves and have not so clearly, and walking by the headquarters of Uber and the headquarters of Lyft, and seeing the protests, and going to the Tenderloin and just see, right next to City Hall, and it's a place that if you just think about the way society has been going, it's a troubling place, and it's not gotten better in the last.
Sounds like it. Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
I know. Well, when did you find how did you, because you didn't, I'm guessing you didn't play a double bass until you got to DC. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. How did that come into your life then? Like, when did you move to DC? I'm assuming that was after high school, but when did that happen?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I went to Ole Miss for a year and a half. Uh-huh. And then during the course of that, after my first year at Ole Miss, I went to the University of Mississippi. It's located in Oxford, in North Mississippi, closer to Memphis, and et cetera, et cetera. But I went there for a year, and then I went to DC for an internship, and then I came back for a half a year, and then I moved to DC and transferred to American University in DC. I was studying international studies at the time. And so that sort of like fueled my decision to go to American University specifically, but also in the back of my mind, American University had an audio production program. So once I got to AU, I also did like sort of at Ole Miss, I did like kind of an accelerated sort of program where I took classes in the winter and the summer also. So essentially by the time I got to AU, by that time I had gotten put, after a couple of internships and some experiences, seeing sort of the professional side of what I could do with an international studies degree. Like I sort of got disillusioned with that. And was gonna and I had already started taking like some of the audio classes, and I was just gonna go ahead and switch my major. But my advisor told me that I essentially only had to take 3 more classes in order to get a degree in international studies. So I just stuck with it and kind of like started to fuse my musical interest more with essentially my political interests, which essentially is what that degree is. It's a political sort of degree. And so essentially I graduated with a degree in audio production and international studies. So when I moved to DC, I was, still very much a saxophone player, and probably got even more serious about it when I moved to DC. But because that I was in the jazz band, et cetera, et cetera. And was like, had for the first time been exposed to jazz, like to real jazz from my standpoint, quote unquote real jazz. Like I had, again, growing up close to New Orleans, I had been to like New Orleans Jazz Fest. I had been to a couple of like, jazz clubs in New Orleans, and it wasn't the same. It wasn't like the jazz. It wasn't the kind of jazz music that I was being inspired by at the time. Like it wasn't bebop, essentially. Mm-hmm. It was more so like, the New Orleans style, like funky, fusion-y type jazz. And like old timey, like Louis Armstrong style, New Orleans style jazz.
Sure. Yeah.
So like, but like the first time I heard bebop was when I moved to DC and saw Sonny Fortune at Twins Jazz, which, oddly enough, today just announced that they're closing after 33 years as a club due to COVID.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was the first time I saw jazz. The next day, they had a jam session there, and I went and met who would be my future teacher, Dr. Will Smith, who's a really great tenor player and jazz and educator in jazz and hip hop. And he was the jazz director at AU. And so I started, like he encouraged me. I started studying with him, and he invited me, like he would organize these jam sessions at the school. And one day I brought my bass guitar, and he was like, "Oh, you play bass, huh? You need to be on upright." And so like at the time, again, it's a similar story. Like nobody was playing the bass up there, or like there was one other person playing the bass, but like not really serious about it. And the school had two of them. And so like basically he just arranged for me to be able to play the bass and like check it out and play it whenever I wanted to. And yeah, it was kind of on from then. Like that was probably when I really started to like, be real. That was probably the point when my like jazz career started, I would say. Because like shortly after, I got the bass and, practiced it, with, et cetera, and, started to play gigs, and like, hang out, going to jam sessions and stuff like that. Which was it was a big thing for me. Like I had never been exposed to that culture, or like, I had always thought that jazz was above me. It's like, oh shit, I'm playing jazz right now. Like, wow.
Right.
And it was like it's a lot. Like for me, it was a lot. Like it was a big, like, confidence thing for me also. As a saxophone player and as a bass player.
Do you still play saxophone? I'm curious.
Just personally.
Okay.
It's been a couple of years since I've done a gig on saxophone. But the last time I did it was with my friend Janelle Lapine, who's an amazing cello player and musician in DC. And she had a gig at some 930 club in DC, and she did like an arrangement of one of her songs. and she had me play alto on it. So that was the last time I played saxophone for a gig, like for people. But it was definitely for more so. It developed more so into like a classical. Like during that early time where I was at AU, like playing the bass and stuff like that. I guess the notion in my mind developed that one way that I could separate it and think about them individually was like to do like classical saxophone and jazz bass. So like it kind of, my saxophone stuff sort of like went more in that direction where I was like playing, going through the classical sax repertoire. I was in the sax quartet in college, and my teacher Noah Getz was actually very influential to me in exposing me to that world, to like the new music world, because I found that like contemporary saxophone playing that's not jazz is really like new music type stuff, contemporary composers type stuff, and that he opened up that world for me, and which I found which I still find to be fascinating and vital and important. Also like within the that classical or orchestral music approach, like how many times we're going to play Beethoven and Brahms and all this kind of stuff when there's all these amazing living composers who we should be celebrating and exploring, things like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point for the saxophone specifically, or just wind music in general, because you don't have that legacy of Brahms writing certainly for saxophone or even wind ensemble. And like I've talked to a bunch of contemporary composers who write larger scale works, and a lot of them say they prefer to write if they're going to write for a large ensemble, wind ensembles their preference, because if they can take it to a university who will give it the time to practice, and actually like make it good and perform it multiple times, versus you write for a symphony orchestra. You're fortunate enough to, let's say, write for the Chicago Symphony, and then half the group's bitching about it. They rehearse it, a minimal amount of time. And so I get why that would be attractive. And so as a result, I think you've got a lot of really interesting composers exploring like saxophone quartet or other wind, just it's an area where people are going to devote time and interest to playing.
100%. So that resulted in like a whole other like track of interests and collaboration, because we also collaborated after I graduated and stuff. And we the interest in like Xenakis and even people like George Crumb, like more electronic-y stuff, because I was also I've also been involved / interested in various forms of electronic music also since high school, like from the hip-hop approach to the the noise approach, so to speak.
That's all. Well, I figured that's the case since the audio production was in your background, but that's really cool. I myself, I have all my gear, and I was working on Ableton Live, just doing some improv yesterday. I used to teach an Ableton Live class. How much of that, what does electronic music look like for you these days? Or if we take the last few years, I mean, do you do a lot in that world?
Absolutely. I actually just released earlier this year. I released a little electronic album of just like the what I've been into recently is the no input mixing board approach, but like ambient style, like not noise style, but more like there's a particular person. Tashimaru Nakamura, who's a he's one of like the pioneers in that approach. And I've seen him a couple of times. I've seen him do like when I first saw him a few times, it was like very much the noise approach. But then maybe like 2 years ago, I played a festival in Germany. Mm-hmm. I played at Fest or whatever, and he did an amazing set. I had been listening to his album that he had released at that time, and it's a very much more like ambient, like subtle approach, but still using the same kind of setup. And I was able to see him do it, and like I got a lot of ideas. Cool. So my electronic stuff has been basically more working more with feedback, also as a way to practice. It's like also a means of practicing for the bass feedback stuff too. Like it's another way of like letting the things feed each other. And as I work, I guess more so to try and incorporate or incorporate those approaches with each other.
Cool.
But yeah, in the past, it's been like, in high school, I was lucky enough to have been sort of gifted a small record collection from my grandmother, who like had a bunch of records in the basement and stuff like that. And got the turntable set up and like was interested very much so in like the turntablism culture, like scratch DJ culture at the time.
Sure.
Which was also going through a transition period, interestingly enough. So like that led to, digging for records and like, being interested in like that was another avenue of like, musical exploration, like in the old school like hip hop approach of like digging for samples and like learning about music through that. So yeah, I was in that frame of mind for a long, like leading into college and throughout college and after college and things like that. That was like kind of where my mindset was. It was like the hip hop approach, but like trying to do something different with that. And then like being exposed also in DC to, a really vibrant, like, experimental electronic music culture with sonic circuits. And their thing was like, it was sonic circuits, and there were like a couple of other, independent, like promoters, Clavius Productions, who was very much more so like the noise approach, like the DIY noise approach, because he put on the shows in his house and stuff like that. And Sonic Circus was more, it was that, but also like more, I guess, academic leaning, experimental electronic music, like, more people with objects or like doing things with Max MSP rather than like, broken electronics and stuff like that, even though that was some of it too. But yeah, like it's funny how all of these things sort of like coexisted at the same time also. All these interests in like, pathway, like deep pathways through like trying to find, I guess, where it would land. Mm-hmm. Because like that, then like in the hip hop thing, like one of the first going out experiences I had in DC was to a like a hip hop cipher, and it was like my first ever experience like that. After like watching a bunch of videos and like being practicing scratching and shit in my room and like digging for records and all this kind of stuff. It was like the first time where I had that experience of like being in a real like boom bap hip hop cipher and like, you know, being involved in like the beat maker circuit, and like doing beat battles and stuff like that. So yeah, that was a thing also.
Yeah, that's cool. For me, electronic music came into the picture later. It as someone who's, you know, playing acoustic bass and sometimes amplified, it just the timbral possibilities that you can literally do anything. You know, whether you're thinking of doing something in Ableton or Max MSP or whatever. I mean, it's like it started to make me rethink timbre kind of in a different way. Yeah.
Exactly. That's effectively what happens. Is like you're listening. It's another form of deep listening, and especially with with that sample approach. And like I can vividly remember the feeling and the sensation. Like the first time I like put a needle to the record and like put it through a sampler and was like, you know, stretching it and, you know, looping it, and then finding another sample and like putting them together and like stacking the sample. Like I remember that sensation, like, and like what it felt like to like slow something down and like hearing the intricacies of the actual like physical sound of like the needle on the record playing the music, you know, playing the information and like, or doing whatever to it. You know, it still fascinates me. And still something that I like that I try to incorporate when I can. So yeah,
it's cool. I'm curious in terms of the, you know, doing radio, getting into that. When did that happen for you?
So in like late 2000, in like 2007, 2008. I started working with WPFW. Again, I was like about to graduate for, you know, with an audio degree, and I'm thinking professionally, so to speak, but also trying to like, you know, fuse interests and all that kind of stuff. And I had met a DJ on that radio station. I'd also been listening to that radio station for, you know, during my course of years, and like, you know, deeply inspired by it. And like, you know, it's a powerful radio station. I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Okay.
It's part of the Pacifica network. You know about that. Like it's the Washington D.C. Pacifica station.
Okay, got it.
PFW. But it's very different from like KPFA and KPFK. Like it's much more music oriented, and it's much more like jazz oriented and like just general Black music oriented. Like its moniker is Jazz and Justice. So, and like it has a contentious place in the network because of that, like historically. But that's another story. But yeah, I had met a DJ, a person by the name of Jamal Muhammad. We actually used to work together at Barnes and Noble, and he was, which is a deep thing. Like there's like a crew of people, you know, you probably remember the times where there was like a crew of people or like certain individuals that would always have the job at like the record store, or like at the record or at the music section at the bookstore type stuff. Like,
sure.
You know, it was that kind of culture happening that I found myself in. But I met Jamal Muhammad working in that scenario at Barnes and Noble. And, you know, he was God rest his soul, you know, he was you know, a classic old jazz cat, you know. He didn't play any instruments, but he was like, he taught me that there's a possibility of being masterful in the music without necessarily playing an instrument. And that was something that like spoke to me at the time. again, as a a would-be DJ, record collector type person, so like that was where I was like trying to get to anyway, was like to master music through like knowing about music and like through checking out music, which is what he sort of like iconicized for me.
Oh wow!
So anyway, I started working with him at WPFW around that time, and he's the one that brought me into the radio. And he was a very, very great mentor of mine. Like, definitely took my music IQ like to like the like infinite levels, and like just turned me on to so much stuff that I see people like just now starting to talk about, like certain albums or like certain people, and also like he had firsthand experience with so many, people from that classic era. He's from DC, and he was in the Navy, and he moved to New York after the Navy in 1957. Okay.
Wow.
And went to Harlem, went straight to Harlem, and was like there for the next like 15 or so, like until the early 70s, and was just like the man on the scene in Harlem, and like went through everybody. Like he was like, he was the cool guy. Like he was the hustler, like the guy that all the cats wanted to like, he was that kind of guy, but also like was involved in the nation, and like, ran with Malcolm X at the time, like in the mid 60s, after some things happened with some musicians.
Right.
And, you know what I mean? Went through that whole thing, and like ended up being a DJ on WPFW, and I was with him, until he passed away. God rest his soul. And again, he took me. He instilled that passion for the station also, and also like the deeper passion in knowing about the history of the music, and like really like checking shit out, essentially.
Yeah.
And like making that applicable to to being a musician.
What a cool mentor to have and someone to work with, and like it just like talk about learning the history and continuing like lifelong learning, just being able to interact with music like that. That's just got to be. I know it is because I do something quasi similar, not the same, but just like what it's having being on the air like that is just it's a obvious motivation to see what's going on and what's new and just learn about the history and lineage and things that people haven't discovered. What a cool aspect of your musicianship, and how cool that all these things kind of feed each other. It seems like, to me at least, you've got the electronic music interest, which feeds the bass playing, and just your it seems like a really cool artistic cauldron you've got going.
Yeah, it's crazy how it happens, but yeah, it's like. Yeah, I'm just grateful to have met the people that, despite, earlier in our conversation, talking about Mississippi and stuff like that, like I did eventually in DC find all the things that I was looking for, essentially. All the things that I felt that I was missing growing up in Mississippi. I found it all. And then some. Like I found that also through that experience, and also like, I guess, following the course of my generation, musically and culturally, I found the opportunity in DC to do something that my peers in, say, New York or like LA couldn't do.
Yeah.
Or like, like the things that were going on in DC weren't happening in those places, and to the certain extent, like the things that I was exposed to, specifically as a Black musician, a Black jazz musician, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
DC was and is an important place for development in that sort of way, because it was like, I was able to see and experience and interact with like Black excellence and learn from that, but also Black excellence that's not like, Harlem or the South Side of Chicago or like LA, like the obvious places, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like
yeah, of course.
It's a place that's in fact deeper in a lot of ways than a lot of those stories, in terms of like in terms of Black Americans having ownership and running things, and like even to this day. And that was one of the things, again, that was so influential for me. When you're asking about the radio, that was so influential to see and be a part of at WPOW, to be a part of a truly independent, Black-run, Black aesthetic radio station on the FM dial with the most powerful signal. So like I found myself like being, having immense pride in that, and almost like to the point of like evangelizing about it. And just like noting the importance of that, and also noting the rarity of that, because to this day I can't think of another station that has that sort of dynamic. That's playing the music, all the music, and is truly independent, Black run. Even though it's part of the Pacifica network, it's independent within that network. And because of it, it's also a pillar within that network, like financially.
Sure. Wow. Well, I appreciate what you do, man. I appreciate Gaylord for turning me on to what you're doing, and I'll be following along. And I thanks for taking. I want to be respectful of your time, but I appreciate the chat. Anything else? Anything you want? I think I know what to link up to. Certainly your site and the album, the Irreversible Entanglements. Is that the am I getting that name, the group name, right?
That's correct.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'll link up to that. Anything else you want? He said check out your is it Gaps? Is that the noise? I was listening to some of that.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the electronic album. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Anything else you want me to link up to? Social media, obviously.
Yeah. Just I'm at Take a Look Around. I want to make sure you have the right website. It's thelukestewart.com. There's an old one that a lot of people go to, but that has information about my history, but it's just not like it was made. It hasn't been updated since like 2012, 2013, something like that.
Luke, thanks for chatting with me. thelukestewart.com is the website. And yeah, it was great to chat. Hope to meet you in person after this pandemic subsides, whatever year that might be. Oh my goodness. But it's great. One of the pleasures of this podcast for me is diving into realms of the music world, let's just say, that are outside of where I usually live. And definitely what Luke does, I would say, is falls into that category. But it's great. It gets me listening to artists that I might not have listened to otherwise. It gets me thinking about things that I might not have thought about otherwise. And so I think of the podcast as something that helps me to learn and grow. I hope you enjoy listening to this as well. I'm guessing if you are still listening to the podcast at this point, you are one of those people. If you haven't reached out in the past and you want to just say hi, or you have a guest suggestion or topic suggestion or anything like that, feedback at contrabassconversations.com will put you in touch with me. And we have links to everything we talk about in the show notes for this on whatever device you're listening to, or just go to contrabassconversations.com, our website, and you can learn more about whoever we're featuring, about the podcast in general, what we've been doing these past 13, almost 14 years at this point. Oh my goodness. If you're not on our newsletter, join the thousands of other folks that enjoy what we do in terms of that. This podcast is a small percentage of the bass-related content that comes out of the team here on the blog and podcast. And I love it. I've been doing it for forever, but we do a lot of other things. So if you like to read, or you like to watch, or you like to get a newsletter and briefly scan it, you can do that. Contrabass Conversations will take you to all of those options. Or follow us on social media if you just like to scroll through Instagram or Facebook or whatever. We're there, and we'll be whatever new platform. If you're coming from the future, which you may be doing. A lot of people listen to old episodes on this podcast, and there's a new social media platform. I'm sure we're there. I am rambling, so I will wrap this up by thanking the team that puts these episodes together: Michael Cooper, Steve Henchy, Trevor Jones, Mitch Mooring, and Krista Copper. Mitch Mooring makes beautiful basses in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Learn more at mitchmooring.com. I am your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.